Hey macro students, so last module we talked about, the definition of the inflation rate and the winners and the losers from inflation. And now, yeah, and we've mentioned, 3% inflation rate is normal and all that. Well, how do they come up with that 3% inflation rate? Like how do they measure that and why do they measure that? So that is our question here. All right. So we start out with our definition of aggregate price level, which is the measure of the overall level of prices in an economy. And they measure that using the market basket. And in that first video that you guys watched, the Scott Walla video with the Federal Reserve, he went over this as well. So they take that sample of goods throughout the economy, potatoes, shoes, gasoline, haircuts, all of those goods and services, and they compare what they were this year versus last year, and that creates that price index. Now, the most common price index is called the CPI, or Consumer Price Index, and so it measures the cost of that market basket, that sample of goods, and it gives a kind of arbitrary, which, like kind of meaningless number to it. And they actually use the year 1982 as the base year, which is pretty cool because that's the year I was born. And so 1982 is the base year. And then in 2017, the number was 245. So if you do the math, you can figure out what the inflation rate between 1982 and 2017 was, if you really want to. And you can use this formula here, which this formula is just the formula for percentage change of any two numbers. So you take the new number, you subtract the old number, and you divide it by the old number, multiply it by 100, and you can get the inflation rate. So, or the percentage change of anything. So here we have, so if we called 2017 year two, because it's the later year, so you would go 245 minus the CPI of year one, which we'll use 1982, our base year, and then you divide it by 100, and then multiply it by 100, and you get out your calculators and you do the math, and you figure out that the answer is 145%. So that means that in those, 7 years? 35 years, the inflation increased 145% in the United States. So what that means is that if something was $100 in 1982, it would be about $245 in 2017. So we could probably assume, like $250-ish today. So that is, so that means that all of those years of having an average of 3% inflation have now come up to this 145% inflation. All right. So here we go. Why do people care about inflation? Why do they care about the CPI? Like, the government, puts a lot of effort into figuring out the CPI, and then using the CPI, they can figure out the inflation rate. Well, why? Well, because many payments are tied to, or what they say, indexed to the CPI. And then if the CPI goes up, payments go up, meaning that if the CPI goes up, maybe people's social security checks will go up. People who are like on disability, or they're a young person who had a parent who died, or they are over the age of 62 and they get social security checks from the government. That's a form of a transfer payment. Well, if inflation happens, then their checks will get bigger, meaning that if the CPI goes up, those checks will go up. So that's true with Social Security checks, other government payments. Sometimes they'll adjust income taxes or the brackets based off of CPIs. But what we really get excited about are wages. Some people's wages are tied to the CPI, meaning that people can go up to their bosses and say, hey, Inflation happened at 3%. I deserve a 3% raise. It's because remember, if inflation happens at 3%, but your wages or your income stays the same, it's like you now have less money. You can buy less stuff with your money, and boo, we don't like that. That's definitely a sad face. So, wages can be tied to the CPI and they can go up when inflation happens, when the CPI goes up. And they call those, they're called a COLA, COLA, and COLA is an acronym for Cost of Living Adjustment, meaning that if inflation happens, it costs more just to live, right? It costs more for your rent, it costs more for your food, it costs more for your clothes, right? Everything costs more. And so they say that that's an increase in the cost of living. So we want to figure out if inflation happens. They want to use the CPI to figure out if inflation happens to know if people deserve a COLA, a cost of living adjustment, meaning that their wages will go up not because they got a raise because they did so good, and not because the company decided to pay their employees more because they made more money, but because if they don't give the people a raise, it will be like they're getting less real money. They can buy less stuff with their money, and people don't like that, and they complain about that, and they quit their jobs over stuff like that. So there you have it. So why do we care about the CPI? Because the CPI tells us if inflation happened, and if inflation happened, we might, quote, deserve more money to make up for that inflation that did happen. And that's it for Mod 52. I kept it pretty short this time. I'm impressed with myself. Don't forget to do your summary, look at the practice problems, and come to the Google Meet and turn in your notes. All right, bye guys.